All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome all of you to our latest iteration of Florida Talks at Home. My name is Keith Simmons. I'm the communications director here at Florida Humanities. I'm going to introduce tonight's program, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Edward González-Tennant, our speaker for tonight. You're going to be uh, in store for a really interesting and fascinating discussion. If you aren't familiar with Rosewood, it's really an aspect of Florida history that I think a lot of you are going to find fascinating. So, normally, Florida Humanities works with cultural partners across the state to put on programs like this in person. But obviously, we can't do that right now. Our goal is to make this virtual series a regular event until we can begin convening once again in person. Next week's event will be on September 30th at 6 p.m., and it will cover the amazing forts that now sit as relics to a bygone age in Florida history. You can register for that event on our Facebook page or by going to our website, floridahumanities.org. At the end of tonight's presentation, you will receive a short feedback survey in your email. We would greatly appreciate it if you take a minute to fill it out and to tell us how the program went and any ways that we can improve. If you have any questions for the speaker during our program, chap it into the chat pod below. I'm going to keep track of the questions, and then I will be able to facilitate a Q&A with Dr. Gonzalez at the end of the presentation. Your support is essential for helping Florida Humanities sustain these programs. So throughout tonight's program, if you enjoy it, if you find it informative or inspiring in any sort of way, we ask that you consider supporting Florida Humanities by going to floridahumanities.org/support. And that's where you can contribute to our organization. And so tonight, we welcome Dr. Edward González-Tennant, a lecturer in anthropology at the University of Central Florida. His work combines archaeology, ethnography, and history. He teaches courses on digital anthropology, disaster anthropology, historical archaeology, mortuary archaeology, and southeastern archaeology. One thing I wanted to note before turning it over to Dr. Gonzalez is that his book, The Rosewood Massacre, An Archaeology and History of Intersectional Violence, is available from the University Press of Florida. We've been able to obtain a special promotion code for those who are participating in tonight's lecture, and we'll be able to provide that at the end of tonight's program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. González-Tennant.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you very much, Keith, for introducing me and inviting me to be part of this exciting at-home series. I'll go ahead and just jump into this. So obviously tonight I am going to be talking about the archaeology of Rosewood primarily, but this means that some of what I talk about, some of what I consider to be archaeology may come as a surprise, right? As a historical archaeologist, which is actually what I'm trained in, we use different data sets than you may associate with archaeology. So here you can see the topics that I'll sort of discuss tonight and kind of move through. For those of you who are unaware, Rosewood is, of course, located kind of an hour southwest of Gainesville, just inland from Cedar Key in Levy County. And so what I'm going to do today is provide a brief history of Rosewood. I'm going to talk about, of course, the destruction of the community, what has become known as the 1923 Rosewood Race Riot or Massacre, or as I'll often refer to it in this talk, a pogrom. And then I'll contextualize that within broader patterns of racial violence in America. And then that will sort of set the stage for me discussing kind of this archaeology of violence and archaeology of hope. And what I mean by an archaeology of violence is an archaeology of something like a massacre or a race riot. And what I mean by an archaeology of hope is how we can bring together different voices, different viewpoints, different methods to support public outreach, but also kind of drive public conversations as an academic, as a researcher or scholar, how I can participate in promoting and helping with conversations, public conversations about racial reconciliation. So dealing with the past, dealing with these really unfortunate and ugly pieces or periods of American history and unfortunately how they continue to resonate in the present. So, for those of you unfamiliar with Rosewood, Florida, the area that became Rosewood, Florida, really started receiving American or European, and then later African or people of African descent settlers in the 1850s and 60s. Of course, during this time, the Civil War occurs and a train line is brought through the area. This is actually the first cross-state railroad in Florida. Connects Fernandina Beach north of Jacksonville with Cedar Key. So it was a huge economic hub that helps the economies of Rosewood, neighboring communities like Sumner, Cedar Key, Archer, Gainesville, all along this rail line prosper economically. Now, in Rosewood in this area by the 1890s, you start to see national economic problems, obviously a large economic downturn in the 1890s nationally, but you also see more local economic downturns. And this has to do with things like milling out of the trees, the red cypress or red cedar trees where Rosewood gets its name from. But a lot of these natural resources that initially bolstered these economies sort of get over extracted. Within a generation, those return, natural resources are replenished, the economy sort of bounce back. This is the time period sort of starting in the 1890s, 1900s, where you see Rosewood become a majority African American community. African Americans had lived there since at least the Civil War and likely prior. We know that this is an area where Maroons, so people of Seminole and African descent, were moving through the area as early as the 1830s, 1820s. So there's a very complex multi-ethnic history occurring here across the 19th century that Rosewood is one part of. So by 1900, Rosewood, a majority African American community with a mixed economy, and that's really important. It means that Rosewood had developed an economy that wasn't simply extractive, right? So Sumner, its neighboring town to the southwest, so about a mile following that rail line to the southwest. You can see this in the back picture, or if I go back a slide here, between Rosewood and Cedar Key. Sumner is a company town. It's a sawmill town. Its sawmill locates there in the early 1910s, and that's all that economy is. It's the sawmill. It's the company. Rosewood had African Americans owning their own businesses, their own homes. We'll return to a lot of this later in the talk, but what that means is that Rosewood's economy, Rosewood's society is pretty unique for these rural locations in Florida, particularly in the early 20th century. Now, Sumner and the Cummer and Sons sawmill that opens there in the 1910s brings a lot of economic activity there. It actually leaches some of that from Rosewood. So you have things like the train depot, the post office, and other businesses or entities move from Rosewood down to Sumner. And yet Rosewood continues to survive and even thrive, right? They have their own community centers, Masonic lodge, churches, a school, and so forth. And they can keep that going, even though they may not be wealthy by anyone's standards. They're prosperous in the sense that that mixed economy keeps that going. And then, of course, by the 1920s, Florida's economy starts to shake again, if you will, across the 20s with tin can tourists in South Florida and the land speculation that sort of runs rampant across the state, right? So in 1926, when Florida's economy crashes, this foreshadows what will happen to the larger country. But in the buildup to that, 1923, when Rosewood is destroyed, this is a period of intense economic growth, and it really touches almost every part of Florida. And so that's the historical context, if you will, for the 1923 Rosewood massacre or pogrom. And I call this a pogrom because, like the Jewish pogroms in Russia half a century before and more, this is really, in some ways, an intentional decision by certain members of specific communities to really run out a minority community, in this case, an African American community. So before we talk about connecting this event to those larger patterns, the 1923 Rosewood Massacre is really a week-long episode of violence and a week-long episode of events. So that begins on January 1st, a Monday, the first day of 1923. A white woman in neighboring Sumner reports an attack, and There's no reason to doubt that this actually occurred. I think Fannie Taylor's account that she was attacked is true. I do think she was the victim of domestic violence. However, she reported that her attacker, or else her attacker became represented as an African American male. And so, either way, what unfolds, of course, is kind of a racial panic by local whites seeking this African American male, a convenient and typical lie at the time, blaming African American men for violence against white women. And so the sheriff deputizes individuals. Over the course of the day, more people come into the area. They head towards Rosewood. They have bloodhounds that are tracking somebody who left Sumner and headed towards Rosewood. The end of that day, they apprehend Sam Carter. So this is Rosewood's longtime resident, but also blacksmith. He's also living in a house that you would have encountered as you move from Sumner to Rosewood. It would have been one of the first Rosewood houses. They interrogate him, and we know from other oral history accounts that the assailant that Fannie Taylor reports is actually a white man. And Sam Carter likely took that individual out of the area, primarily because they were both Masons, or so the oral histories go. Masons, of course, were segregated organizations back in the 1920s. But at the local level, blacks and whites would sometimes honor those obligations across the color line. So it's likely that Sam Carter did take the assailant, perhaps, out of the area. The white mob interrogates him about this individual. And of course, they're asking about a black assailant. He took a white person out of the town. They're unsatisfied with his answers. And that day ends with Sam Carter being interrogated, unable to provide these answers, and eventually shot multiple times while they're interrogating him, and by which they had hung him from the neck from a tree. And when he could not supply these answers, they killed him. And his body is riddled with bullets and left on the ground, where it's found later that day or early the next morning. Now, violence ceases for 2 days or more. And historically, we've sort of been puzzled by this. But as years go by, new evidence emerges, including the digitization of weather records from the Cedar Key Weather Station, which records that during these 2 days, particularly Tuesday and Wednesday, a large storm moved into the area and dropped the equivalent of 1 to 2 months worth of rain over a 36 to 48 hour period. So that by the end of end of Wednesday, beginning of Thursday, when this rain abates and the storms move out of the area, some whites in Sumner had become, for whatever reason, dissatisfied with the conclusion of events on Monday. They move towards Rosewood, gathering forces. They approach the Carrier household. So Sarah Carrier, her families, her granddaughter, Philomena, these people, particularly Sarah and Philomena, had been witnesses. They actually worked as laundry women for the Taylor household. So they were witnesses to the events of Monday. And that's important. That's something we're going to come back to. So as this white mob moves into Rosewood and attacks the Carrier household, there's a pitched gun battle that lasts for hours. 2 white men are injured. They are taken away from the scene when whites leave and return to Sumner to replenish their bullets. Those 2 injured white men are taken back. They do later die, and they're buried nearby in this part of Levy County. During this time, people flee if they had not already fled. They start fleeing Rosewood across Friday into Saturday. Friday morning, of course, 2 brothers from Levy County take a train two brothers from Cedar Key take a train out of that town into Rosewood, and they evacuate the women and children. They felt if they had taken any of the male citizens of Rosewood onto the train and then were later caught, that they would be subjected to violence. But they felt that they could get the women and children out safely. And of course, that train takes Rosewood residents to places like Archer, Gainesville, Jacksonville, where descendants live to this day. It's during this time that James Carrier returns to bury the bodies of his mother and brother who were victims of the violence at their home. He's caught at the freshly dug graves of his family, where he's also lynched and likely buried. Sheriff Walker notifies the governor, who promptly takes a 3-day hunting holiday. Sheriff Walker notifies the governor that everything is sort of handled. But then, of course, the next day on Saturday, a much larger group, maybe 100 to 150 plus whites, return to Rosewood. They burn every Black-owned building to the ground. This is reinforced with individuals from Gainesville, likely members of the Klan, which the previous weekend had held one of the largest Klan rallies in the entire Southeast in Gainesville. As those individuals are driving to Rosewood, they actually shoot an African-American man in the back of the head as he's walking down Highway 24. His name is Mingo Williams, so he's sort of seen as the eighth victim next to Lexi Gordon, who's an elderly woman who actually had been hiding under her house and is shot when she tries to escape the mob. And then over that Saturday and Sunday, everything in Rosewood is destroyed. About a month and a half later, the state does convene a grand jury. It finds insufficient evidence, in fact, uses a term or a phrase that was all too common at the time. It concluded that this violence had occurred at, quote, the hands of persons unknown. So literally nobody faces any charges. Nobody is prosecuted for the destruction of this town and the killing of 6 African Americans and 2 whites. Those whites, of course, were actually killed attempting to force entry into an African American home violently. So when we talk about this, this is sort of what we've known about Rosewood since a really an excellent historical report was written in the early 90s as part of the state legislature's investigation. Larry Rivers, Maxine Jones, who headed that. These are professors who were teaching at Florida schools at the time. They produced an amazing historical report. I found no fault with that. I can't. They did an amazing job. And that's, largely what we're talking about. And a lot of people have talked about Rosewood previously. This is where we're getting a lot of our information. And one of the things I've been interested in doing is sort of contextualizing Rosewood. And we'll see when we talk about an archaeology of violence, extending our knowledge of Rosewood beyond the events of 1923. But one of the ways we can contextualize Rosewood is to talk about ways scholars have approached race riot and lynching studies. And these are actually active fields of scholarly research, the sort of evidence of how tragically common these events really were in American history, that during the 1800s and 1900s, literally thousands of lynching. And what we mean here is just an extra legal murder, right? It doesn't mean necessarily hanging. It means a group of private citizens taking the law into their own hands and murdering somebody. Most of those lynching events targeted African-American men, but there were events that targeted other communities in other parts of the country. Race riots, of course, took on different forms depending what time you're talking about. Race riots up until World War II were largely pogroms, largely designed, and we'll talk about some of those in a moment, largely designed to push out minority communities. So previous studies, and there are literally thousands of articles, hundreds of chapters, dozens, if not hundreds of books that talk about race riots and lynching in American history. And up through sort of the 1990s, the 2000s, even though this is excellent research, many of those reports sort of sought unidimensional reasons, looking at things like fluctuations in economics, right? So economic hardship would drive whites to attack blacks. I, for instance, have often, and I think most people who study these things now, or in the last generation or two, we find those sorts of explanations wanting or lacking, right? So what I've tried to do is bring in theoretical perspectives from Black feminist thought, intersectionality, and these are sort of theories and methodologies that highlight the multidimensionality of violence, right? Communities don't decide to attack neighboring communities of different racial or ethnic backgrounds simply because they have trouble paying rent or paying their bills, right? There are much deeper cultural things at play there. And while those events may be trigger events, we have to sort of look, I think, at these broader histories to make sense of this. So intersectionality, which is sort of a buzzword, and people approach it positively and negatively. But for our purposes here, this is really about power and who has it and who wields it and the different forms of power. So when we're talking about the multidimensionality of violence, what that means is that different forms of violence perpetrated against minority communities have changed in their frequency, changed in their type over the course of the 20th century. It means that power and violence are related in American society, and that relationship has remained constant across history. We can illustrate this historically, and it means that Rosewood remains, unfortunately, painfully relevant. So when we talk about intersectionality in regards to violence, we're really talking about different kinds of violence intersecting one another. So the first type of violence I'll briefly discuss is interpersonal violence. When most of us hear the word violence, this is what we think about, right? This is the laying of hands on one another. This is physically hurting somebody. So a classic example of this in terms of racial interpersonal violence would be lynching. And so here is now, unfortunately, outdated data. And I say unfortunate because the new updated data adds another 1,000 lynchings to these numbers. This chart here is from the Tuskegee Institute, and it shows lynchings from 1892 to 1930. Now we realize that there's about 3,200 lynchings recorded here. We now can add another 1,000 to that from work by institutions like Equal Justice Initiative and so forth. So what this looks like at first is, of course, that lynchings tapered off starting in sort of the early 20th century. But what that covers up, I suppose, is that while numbers of lynchings may have decreased, their brutality sharply increased. And so this is when, for instance, Amy Louise Wood remarks or terms these lynchings spectacle lynchings. And they really are spectacular in the worst sense of that word. So white communities would hold African Americans, mostly men, against their will for days, while newspapers ran advertisements inviting people to town for the lynching. Trains would add additional cars so more people could get to town. This was really a society-wide activity. And then once it took place, it took on a brutally carnivalesque visage or appearance as white mobs would sort of really celebrate in not just killing these individuals, but also burning their bodies, dismembering their corpses, taking of souvenirs, an act of postcard business industry sprang up around this. So you could buy and trade postcards of lynchings. It really was, numbers were much lower, but the brutality of it became much, much greater. We can also talk about race riots, and the period between World War I and sort of 1923 is a particularly brutal time in American history for race riots. We can talk about the East St. Louis race riot, which Charles Lumpkins has referred to as a pogrom. This really is an intentional movement by local whites in St. Louis to purge the African American community in East St. Louis. 1917, the National Guard are called in, and then some members of the National Guard, in fact, start to participate in anti-Black rioting themselves. Across 1918 and into 1919, 1919 sort of culminates with the Red Summer, when there's dozens of race riots in urban centers from DC to Omaha in Nebraska to Chicago to Los Angeles and everywhere in between. Chicago, a week-long episode of violence sort of unfolds after an African-American boy crosses the invisible line between the black and white sections in Lake Michigan, and a white man throws rocks at him to get him to go back to his side, hits the boy, who I think is 14 or 15 years old, in the head, and he drowns, and the police take no action, and this sort of is a catalyst for this violence. But really what had been happening is sort of anti-Irish and anti-Black sentiments have been kind of leveled against each other, so there was really a powder keg there. Omaha, Nebraska. A lot of people don't think of Omaha, Nebraska as being a place with a historically Black community, but it does have a significant one. The violence escalates to the point there where the white mayor attempts to intercede and stop the lynching, and the mob turns on him and lynches him. He actually survives and flees, and the violence there only stops when an enormous torrential downpour and thunderstorm moves into the area and extinguishes that violence. So something, again, that almost happened in Rosewood but didn't. Then, of course, Tulsa, 1921, has received a lot of press lately, where 40 blocks of Little Africa, Greenwood, Greenwood, Tulsa, is burned to the ground. The violence escalates to the point there where local whites are literally chartering private airplanes and dropping incendiary devices on the neighborhoods there. We can also talk about two other types of violence. So the first one would be structural violence. And this is basically how the structures of society are organized to disenfranchise minority communities. So we've got classic examples like the Sundown Town movement, which actually started in the Western US, particularly with violent expulsions of Hispanic and Chinese or Asian communities from different towns. California, for instance, has something like 900 anti-Chinese riots and or lynching events over its history. This literally spreads across the country, and a sundown town is either a town that forms as an all-white place, so like many suburbs, but also could be a place where minority communities are violently pushed out. And I use as an example, I grew up in Northwest Arkansas, so here's a advertisement for Siloam Springs, Arkansas, which was about half an hour or so from where I grew up. This once boasted the most churches per capita. It held literally the Guinness world record for this. And you can see outlined in black there part of the positive things about moving to Siloam Springs. No malaria, no mosquitoes, and no Negroes. And I apologize for using that term. I just want to quote that though. And so this is how blatant and everyday and ubiquitous these sorts of structural violence became. We can also talk about symbolic violence. So Hollywood cinema, the eugenics movement were also pushing racial ideology. Obviously, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, released in 1915, is literally credited with rebirthing the Ku Klux Klan, which had sort of not existed since it was outlawed in 1871 by an act of Congress. You have the eugenics movement, which builds and builds. And so in 1924, the U.S. rewrites its immigration law. It actually has eugenics scholars engaged in that. And so just to sort of highlight just how common eugenics was biological science a century ago, and it was an honor. You can see here in the newspaper clipping, I'm here in Orlando, Rollins, and this is not a dig at Rollins College. It's a great school. I have many friends who teach and go there. But the Rollins Dean in 1921 is named to this U.S. Eugenics Council. And if you could read that, and I'm not sure you can here, he's joining presidents and professors from places like Harvard, UCLA, University of Pennsylvania, University of Chicago, literally kind of a who's who of the most prestigious universities. So this was big news, right? The dean from Rollins is joining this huge group, but this group existed literally to promote eugenic science, which really is racial ideology masquerading as science. So when we talk about intersectional violence, these three types of violence, they never work, right? Just one or the other. They're always working in concert. And so we can actually look at an excerpt from those 1871 congressional Klan trials. And I do warn you, I'm going to read something here that is actually fairly graphic, and I apologize for that. But this excerpt is describing what happens when three Klansmen are chasing African Americans in South Carolina. The African American men take refuge with a white woman. The Klansmen arrive, the African American men run away. The Klansmen actually decide to stay, and they attack the white woman. And so here you can see they've brought her out of her home, and the witness is being asked what had happened, and they said to fetch a pot of tar. And they ask, what happened? And the witness says he then poured it into her as much as he could. And the interviewer is saying, into her, what do you mean? In her privates? And so the witness says, yes, he poured it in her privates. So this is, a gruesome example of interpersonal violence visited upon the allies, in this case, of African Americans, but it's also showing sort of this symbolic violence, right, that would be visited upon anybody that's sort of not, in this case, white and male and in a position of power. But also it's structural, right? We know historically and still today, that there are deep relationships in many parts of the country between the clan, police departments, the legislative branch, right? So these Klansmen may very well have been police officers or judges. They would have not, the structure of society was such that it protected them. And so it's these sorts of events where, if you remember the nooses that were hung in a high school tree outside of or in Jena, Louisiana in 2007, why some people were like, whatever, it's just a joke. But other people were like, you can't joke like this, right? This is, it's these sorts of deep histories of intersectional violence that means a symbol like that carries more than just sort of a crass joke. They deeply cut these communities that have experienced intergenerational forms of trauma because of them. So I'm going to sort of brush through this slide quickly. This is kind of I'm an academic and a scholar, and I have to think of new words for these sorts of things. But I'm talking here really about assemblages of intersectional violence. So you have interpersonal, structural, and symbolic forms of violence. We've seen with interpersonal, rates fall down like lynchings, but brutality gets more. Structural, we have things like unfair incarceration rates, unfair application of the death penalty to members of minority communities, and then, of course, symbolic violence, Hollywood cinema, the eugenics movement. And if you're unfamiliar, right, forced sterilization, there's still states that have these laws on the book where the state can forcibly sterilize individuals because they're feeble-minded, which could mean they're poor. In the past, it could mean they were members of LGBTQIA plus communities, and so forth, right? In other words, not normal, whatever that meant. All of these different forms of violence are changing across time and space. So interpersonal sort of drops off, but is replaced by structural and symbolic. And this is why we know that an event in 1923 in Rosewood still resonates, not just because the descendants of the people who survived are experiencing intergenerational trauma, but also the loss of intergenerational wealth, but because our very society is reconfiguring itself not to necessarily eliminate racial violence, but simply to change the face of it. So what we can do now is we can shift and sort of talk about, well, what can archaeology reveal about these events? Is there new information? And some of this new information comes from using familiar data in new ways. So digital technologies like computer mapping, geographic information systems allow us to take things like historic deeds and census records and reconstruct the property ownership in a place like Rosewood circa 1922, right? So Rosewood was rural, never incorporated. There are no city directories. There are no maps, plat maps, or anything like that of Rosewood. So to reconstruct who lived where, when, how much property, what property, where is that property located, literally have to go through thousands of deeds and reconstruct the metes and bounds descriptions in those deeds for hundreds, in this case, between 1870 and 1930 in Rosewood, it's something like 476 different property deeds, being reconstructed. And then we attach census data so we can start to really approach this like a landscape. And of course, as an archaeologist looking at entire landscapes, in this case, an entire community, this is something that archaeology does very well. And so we're using documents, we're doing documentary archaeology, using a data set that is often associated with historians, but we're using it to do a very different thing. And so when we bring all of these data sets together, we can start to learn some of the complexity and the nuance of this event, but also what unfolded before it, because we can see the community developed through time, but also afterwards, right? A common assertion here is that Rosewood was destroyed because it was a land grab. African Americans didn't pay their property taxes, the state took ownership, and local whites bought these properties for next to nothing. And that's not exactly true. In fact, the last African American who sells their property in Rosewood doesn't do so until the 1950s. But most did sell their properties relatively quickly. We can look at the McCoy farmstead here, purchased just after 1900 by John and Mary McCoy. They purchase it, 1900, 150 acres. And then in May of 1923, 4 to 5 months after the riot, they sell it, all 150 acres, at a rate of $2.90 an acre. Within a year, the two white men who bought it turn around, subdivide it into 50-acre parcels, and sell each of those parcels at a rate of $10 an acre. So this is not to sort of simply state that it wasn't a land grab. That land grab still occurred. I just don't think it's fair to say that that was the only impulse. I think there are deeper cultural reasons here, which is why I've spent the time talking about different forms of violence. But this sort of data allows us to look at those more complex interactions. And we see this happening. And in fact, we see some white neighbors helping African Americans try to hold on to their property, which is ultimately unsuccessful. And then we do see some white neighbors taking advantage of this. So when we've created all of this information, what this also allows us to do are using property records, historical aerials from a generation later, census, on and on and on. This acts as a predictive model. It tells us the location of structures in and around Rosewood. So one of the first places we went to test this model to do archaeology was at the site of the Masonic Hall. And so we did archaeology here in 2010. We unfortunately had to halt those excavations because a research partner, not a research, but an individual, private individual, came to the site and the area really around the site and began looting. And so we had to kind of halt our excavations to help protect that and other sites. But we found amazing artifacts here. So the Masonic Hall, this would be a community area. We found artifacts that suggest a community sort of area. We have oral histories that say the Masonic Hall was used as a school by the African American community when their African American school had been burnt or partially destroyed for a year. So it's a community center in addition to serving the purposes of being a Masonic Hall. And what we found there are really fascinating and tragic reminders of this event. So you can see in the upper right-hand corner, two glass bottles, sort of the top portions, the shoulders and the neck. On one side, it looks very clear and defined. On the other side, it looks cloudy and misshapen. And that's because the one it's the same type of bottle, right? It'd be like two Coke bottles. However, one was found about 30 feet or more from the outline of the structure we identified through GIS and archaeology, and one was found right underneath where that structure stood. And I spoke to foresters and so forth. What happened to that cloudy glass is it's actually been heated to a point where it's started to liquefy and deform. There's sand grains embedded in it. And I asked, well, could a forest fire do that? And they said, no, a forest fire sends all the energy, all the heat into the air. A structural fire, when it collapses in, pushes that heat into itself and the ground. So we can hold here one bottle that was discarded before the 1923 event, 30 or 40 feet away from it. We can hold one that was actually impacted by the event itself. The same with the bullet, which was shot into the structure. We sort of interpret that angular 90-degree angle deformation of that bullet because it hit like the corner of like a beam, a wood, a structural element. And so we can hold these artifacts, and this is very unusual for an archaeologist to hold an artifact and be able to say this artifact was deposited and or affected on this specific date. So it's tragic, but it's also powerful to hold these sorts of objects in our hands to recover them. Over the intervening now 10 years, we've worked elsewhere. We've documented the remains of the railroad, so things like a trestle bridge, where we update these with the Florida Master Site File. And I'm just flipping here. So we find evidence of not just the period before, during, and after, well, before and during Rosewood, but even after, when the turpentine industry was active across the 18 and 1900s. And that's a Hurdy cup fragment. That's a picture. This is sort of a ceramic cup that when you score a tree, you hang and it catches the sap from these pine trees to produce turpentine. We've continued to keep working. We had funding from the Florida Division of Historical Resources that funded 2 summers of work. So here you can see some of my students out there with me doing shovel testing and other excavations. We've been able to identify new sites, prehistoric and historic sites. So sites that predate any people of European or African ancestry living in the area, going back thousands of years, but even sites more recently, like hunting cabins and so forth. So some of these properties have literally 4, 5, 6,000 or more years of history in a small area. Also, as part of this work, we conducted ground penetrating radar surveys. So at Rosewood, this revealed dozens of unmarked graves. If you're looking at this image, the ones marked in red are graves and or depressions that could be identified visually. Either they had grave markers, which is only 3 or 4, or they were clear depressions that were associated with graves. All the ones that are only green with sort of a darker outline, those only appeared in the GPR analysis. And so when you look at historical records for Rosewood, we see 37 or 40 or so burial records. So death certificates listing Rosewood as the place the individual was buried. And so now with the GPR results, we're actually able to sort of match up the remains at the site with those historical documents. And most of these, probably 2/3 or more, are not visible walking around the site. We also expanded, and I think this is really important, we expanded our area of interest to look at Sumner. So we did a ground penetrating radar survey at Shiloh. So this is the white cemetery. Even though there are people of different ethnicities buried here, it is a majority white burial ground with honestly a fascinating history that stretches back to one of, if not the earliest grave in this area. Is actually located here. 300 marked burials. The GPR survey revealed another 70 plus unmarked burials. Also revealed things like, if you can see this, the 13 and 14 are our grids, and sort of undercutting 13 and moving over, that's a gopher tortoise burrow. So the GPR shows us a lot in a very accurate way, a lot of what's going on underground. I just included that because I thought it was kind of neat. We've also used other emerging technologies. So unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, commonly known as drones. We've flown drone flights over many of these sites that allows us to collect low altitude imagery. We also can use those photos and other photos that we collect to build, in this case, right, a 3D model of the Rosewood Cemetery, so we can use to visualize and document and preserve the site. We can use photogrammetry, which basically involves taking a series of photos and then using a computer to calculate mathematically a three-dimensionally accurate model. And then, as you can see here on the right, that allows us to sometimes, these gravestones, for instance, are not legible, but with the 3D scanning, we can actually make out the text on them. And then, of course, what we did at Rosewood and to a lesser degree at Shiloh is we straightened headstones, we cleaned them in consultation with the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and basically tried to respectfully repair and take care of these markers as best we could. I should mention with the Rosewood Cemetery, we're very fortunate. It is privately owned, and the individual who owns it has spent decades of his own time and resources making sure this site is protected and taken care of. So in that regard, we're very fortunate that the individual who owns this property cares so much about history. For decades now, descendants of the individuals buried here have been allowed to and are always allowed to visit their ancestors buried here. It's really sort of a touching chapter in an otherwise tragic story. Also, right, John Wright, the man who owned a store in Rosewood, the white store owner, who's credited by many Rosewood survivors as offering to protect African-American children and women, but particularly children. Many African-American children in Rosewood have fond memories of the Wright family. And so we have a 3D model here of John Wright's grave, which now has a new marker. And that was a citizen-led fundraising thing to do that. Next to him is his wife, and next to her are their 3 children, all of whom passed away within the span of a few months, likely due to like a yellow fever epidemic that swept through the area. So when you're trying to understand why did the Wrights have such an affinity for children, I think tragically next to them, the graves of their 3 young children sheds light on that to a large degree. And then, of course, this is something I want to take a moment to talk about. So again, returning to this map, you can see the Carter home and blacksmith shop there. So remember, all of this data on the left-hand side here, we have home ownership. So we know in Rosewood that mixed economy meant that African Americans in Rosewood owned their own homes at rates far higher than African Americans in the state of Florida, the Southeast US, the country as a whole. Simultaneously, in neighboring Sumner, whites owned their homes at rates far below white ownership of properties in the state, the region, and the nation as a whole. So jealousy sounds like not a serious enough emotion to attach to this, but clearly the prosperity of these two towns were very different. Even if some people in Sumner may have had more money, they didn't necessarily own their own homes or businesses like the majority of people living in Rosewood. And so what we see here is the beginning of that week of violence when that white mob leaves Sumner and moves into Rosewood. The first place they encounter is Carter. Remember, Carter had taken the assailant out of the area. He was a witness. Rain moves in. 2 days, 2.5 days later, the mob returns. They approach the Carrier home, which, if you see here, we now know wasn't the next home. You literally had to pass the vast majority of Rosewood to get to that home. But members of the Carrier family were also witnesses. So one of the reasons my book is called The Rosewood Massacre, but in the book I talk about why this is more appropriately considered a pogrom. This is why. It was not the madness of crowds who sort of became unhinged and ran rampant for several days across the landscape. This was an intentional choice. These were rational actors acting in such a way to silence witnesses, and sort of cover up probably a buildup to violence that some had planned for, at least during this week, for more than just kind of an immediate reaction. And now finally, I want to shift to talking about an archaeology of hope. So I'm gonna kind of speed through here so we have some time to talk, but also a lot of these things I'm talking about are available at this virtualrosewood.com website, which I've been running for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years now. No funding to do that. So thanks, various funding agencies I've applied to. But one of the things that I've done here, oral histories with, at the time when I started this research, there were still two survivors, Robbie Morton and Mary Hall Daniels, both of whom have passed away since I've done this research. I created a small little 30-minute, 26-minute documentary that can be used on bus tours and so forth to sort of explore the history of Rosewood beyond the destruction of it. So some of that research I've talked about here, but also more than half of this is dedicated to listening to these two women talk about their lives after the destruction of Rosewood. And so Robbie Morton here discusses her life, which basically she was sent away by her father early in that week with her sister to family members in another community. They sort of lost track of their father. They kind of joined migrant farm worker groups. They moved south. They ended up in Riviera Beach outside or north of Miami today. And she's describing here going to a new church, a Hearst Chapel AME church. And you can read this here, so I won't read it, but or at least not the whole thing. When her and her sister go there, they went there. They had no idea their father was there, and they see him sitting there. They didn't know where he was. They hadn't seen him in months. They didn't even know if he was still alive. And so there he was at the front of that church. And I can describe this, even as I describe this, it's sort of remarkable and touching. But hearing her describe this in her 90-something-year-old voice, it just offers a whole different dimension to all of this, right? And so making sure we have some of those voices in the project has always been important. One of the other big projects that I undertook in talking with descendants and their advocates and their friends was, how can we make this history living for people today? And so one of the things we talked about was reconstructing virtually this town. And so this is the initial, and I'm laughing because if you look at this is hokey. This is one of the initial iterations of this, right? So I'm using a program that doesn't even exist anymore. On the right-hand side, that's the website. If you remember websites from the 2000s, that's what they used to look like. Of course, over the years, we've been able to update this new information. This is the current version of Virtual Rosewood that went live, sort of 2010, 2011. Over the years since then, We've been improving the look of this. We've been bringing in new data. So this is LiDAR data, which is extremely accurate data of the Earth's surface. So as we're building a new version of Rosewood, of virtual Rosewood, it's extremely accurate. And so we're calling this new version Rosewood an Interactive History. And the goal here is, right, it's more like a video game. You download it, and I'm going to flip through some screens here. And this takes you through the community. And so you enter a virtually reconstructed, much more realistic version of Rosewood as it existed in 1922. As you move towards structures, we talk about the different types of historical information that goes into interpreting it. Where is it placed? Why does it look this way? All of that sort of stuff. We put as much family history into this as well. And then you can travel right through various menus. You can visit other sites, and we're aiming to have that completed in the next month or so. We're working on a documentary that will go live, hopefully for PBS stations, not just YouTube, right, that talks about the last 15 years of archaeology and historical work. So that's really what it's sort of geared for. Research continues, so descendants continue to reach out, and I'm always happy when that happens. I have lots of historical information that can often help identify genealogical information, marriage licenses, and so forth for these individuals, and I'm always happy to do that. And then finally, I'll end here. So I zipped through that, tried to keep this right around 45 or 50 minutes to give us time for questions. But this is the book. There's a hardcover version, which nobody can afford because it's $80. There's a paperback version that's much more reasonable at $24.95, $25. If you use this FLAHUM, so FLAHUM code, you can purchase the paperback for $18 plus shipping. So that's the end of the lecture, I believe. And make sure I don't have a slide hiding behind that. I do not. So that's it. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much again for your presentation. And there really is a lot of fascinating information that I think you covered in a really short amount of time. And we did have a couple of questions from our audience. And if you do have some questions, certainly feel free to continue to type them into the chat window, and I'll try to cover as many of them as possible. One of the things that I think I would like for us to start off with is earlier in your presentation, you talked a lot about quantifying this violence and quantifying lynchings. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more. How does that work? How do you quantify these aspects of violence? What are some of the records that you might go to figure out how these incidents happened? And also related to that, what was some of the newspaper coverage like, particularly in Florida, to your knowledge, of these types of incidences that occurred in our state?
Okay. So yeah, the types of data you would use, there's many types. Death certificates are I think the most obvious, or the first one people start with. Census records are also a big part of that. For minority communities, African Americans in particular, these are notoriously unreliable data sets. And so, the researchers who in the 1990s did this research, they sort of came up with the 6 African American and 2 white individuals. So the number of 8 count based on those sorts of data sets. And I've not found, that doesn't mean there weren't more people who were killed, but I haven't found evidence of that. And that doesn't mean there isn't evidence of it. I haven't found it. So that's also part of the reason why working with the property records, tax records, these offer more insight into who lived there, how long they had lived there, did they leave, when did they leave. So for me, it's really sort of trying to put these different data sets together like in a jigsaw fashion to help with that. And then the second part of the question with the newspapers. So this was national news, particularly in the Black press. So many African-American newspapers ran stories about this. Also, many white-owned papers. And as you can imagine, depending on what part of the country or who owned the paper, it sort of determined what tact they took with it. Obviously, the black press, was a sort of one mind decrying this yet again another episode of this violence. Because for us today, hearing about Rosewood and similar events like Tulsa or whatnot, this is new, and we sort of feel like this must be exceptional in the sense that it didn't happen a lot. But at the time, unfortunately, it was happening all the time. It was happening, like some of these years, it was happening multiple times a week or every few weeks. And, that's obviously tragic, but it also means like just today, people could sort of get overwhelmed by this type of coverage. So I think all of those things are playing out. Of course, Rosewood was an entire community destroyed. So it did get, I think, more coverage than some of the other events. And so there, the unfortunate reality, there are definitely other events like this that played out in Florida and elsewhere. And I know that Paul Ortiz was here a week or two ago talking about Ocoee. So that's another increasingly well-known one here in Florida. But certainly there were other examples. Jacksonville had, Tampa area. These are other places where there were race riots and or lynchings that took place. So, yeah.
Okay. Just as a quick question for clarification, someone asked, when did the settlement of Rosewood begin?
So that is, depends what you mean by that, I suppose. But in terms of like Black Rosewood, we have records going back to at least the 1870s. We have property deeds, railroad directories, and those sorts of evidence that talk about a community named Rosewood since at least the 1850s, 1855, which is, of course, more or less just after statehood, within a decade. And so that's a little unusual because if you know the history of Florida, obviously settlement of peninsular Florida was slow going. So, in terms of an exact date, certainly after the state was founded, but also, you could have settlers out there, but we definitely know white settlers were moving into the area in the 1850s. So within a decade of statehood, we do think that there were Maroon, and by that we mean Seminole and peoples of free peoples of African descent moving through that area from the Panhandle and all the way down to Bradenton, Miami, and eventually the Bahamas. So, but that's not settling Rosewood. So it doesn't mean there weren't people of African descent there before that, but they weren't settling something they thought of as Rosewood, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. What I want to do is I want to shift a little bit and talk about more of your I guess tactical work as an anthropologist and some of your work in doing archaeology. And so I wonder if you could just tell us in terms of some of this work that you've done in Rosewood and some of the work that you've done in other sites, what tends to be the most effective tool when it comes to doing some of this archaeology? Would it be drones? Is it GIS? What happens to be that tool?
Um, so I would say, and this is something that I guess my book got critiqued about, is there's not a lot of archaeology in a traditional sense in here. So I would say that, there are some interesting things we could do if we had access to more properties. And this is all privately owned, so that restricts access in all sorts of ways. I'm an archaeologist. I work for the state. Obviously, there are issues with private land ownership. Some private individuals just don't want somebody who represents the state on their property. And obviously, I do, and I have to respect that. So in a place like Rosewood, documentary evidence treated as a form of archaeological data has become one of the primary data sets that we have to work with. I mean, what's fascinating is and we don't have maps or anything, right? So we had to really dive into this data in a different way. What's interesting is as we get access to new properties, whatever those historical documents tell us what we will or won't find. And I didn't mention this. We've tested areas that we expected to find nothing, and we found nothing. So that information used in this new way with GIS and so forth is proving really useful. And I would think, honestly, that more archaeologists should be using those data sets in other places. I, of course, keep doing traditional archaeology because there's something emotive and powerful about holding people's possessions in your hand. And they can tell us important things about identity, purchasing, consumption, all that sort of stuff. But we have to find those places. And in these sorts of rural locations, right? I mean, a rural town is not like towns we think of today. It's spread across 2 miles. There may only be a few dozen structures, and you might have to walk 10 or 15 minutes to get to the next one. So obviously, we can't dig 2 square miles. So basically, as a historical archaeologist, and this is what I tell my students, we use 3 data sets: documents, which surprises people when an archaeologist use oral history, which I think also surprises people when archaeologists use it, and then artifacts. And so a historical archaeologist would use all 3 of those data sets. And I think the historical archaeology projects that use all 3 are the strongest, particularly when we're talking about events or topics like this.
I want to touch on, you talked about oral histories. I want to touch on that in just a second. But particularly in your experience in doing archaeology work at Rosewood, have you done any investigations where you've come across something surprising, especially if you've come across something that has contradicted what is sort of the conventional wisdom as to what's happened with Rosewood?
Um, I I mean, I guess I could spin this like, well, I've kept an open mind, and but in reality, um, I've I would say I don't think nothing that's been like an outright contradiction, right? Really, I think this has been a story of adding details and adding nuance. Because, like the historians in the 90s did, they put together this incredible outline of the event of 1923, an incredible picture of a community at that time, and then sort of extending that history backwards and forwards. Um, this is where different types of data set allow us to go backwards in time, and then of course just trying to draw on oral histories. And of course there are oral histories collected in the 90s. Those have been a wealth of information because they were with survivors and witnesses of the event, so that provides us really important information. The I think probably the most surprising thing is finding, as I bring all of these things together, is sort of, and I've been asked or even challenged on this, right? I've always referred to Rosewood as a prosperous area, but I have had to counter that. I don't mean a wealthy group. I mean, some families there were probably wealthy by the standards of the day, but everything we keep finding just attests to a community that um, was a lot more resilient. I mean, if this, right, and I guess that's maybe not quite the right question here, but if Rosewood had survived, just to think about what Rosewood would look like today, or the descendants, what they would have access to today, given what their family. I mean, they're right. So things in the documentary record that become surprising are seeing how much they invested in their school, seeing how important education was. I mean, the African Americans in that part of Levy County, particularly Rosewood and Sumner, were definitely sending their children to school later and later in life, right? Keeping them in school for longer than their white neighbors were. So there was a real investment in education already a century ago, and that's not so much revealed by the archaeology, like digging things up, but understanding what that means in relation to all this other stuff. That's I mean, I guess it's kind of, but it's just really cool to see them, like they had a community they cared about, and they were investing in that community, and being able to fill that in, I think is, and I'm filling it in not as somebody who's a descendant, right? They already know this. I'm not telling descendants, for the most part, new stuff most of the time, but being able to represent this to people who are coming to this from the public, that's something where I can kind of leverage this information or this data in a way that I think underscores that in an important way.
Absolutely. And I think there are sort of two other types of questions I'd like to ask you, and they kind of come with, I guess, the way that we remember Rosewood or think about Rosewood in some more sort of practical ways. And I think you and I had discussed this particular element before that I'm referring to, which are graveyards or grave sites and resting places. So I wonder if you could just spend a moment and talk to us that from the standpoint of an anthropologist, what do you see as the significance of graveyards and the significance of sort of these final resting places, and how is that significant when it comes to finding these places in areas like at the Rosewood site?
Well, I mean, so obviously, cemeteries anchor memory, anchor identity to place, right? They're incredibly emotive places. We all experience cemetery, right? Nobody walks by a cemetery and doesn't engage with it in some way, doesn't recognize it as an important place, whether you're spiritual, whether for whether you're related to the people there, whatever. Most of us recognize that this is important because people are investing time there. I mean, what's really interesting too is seeing people do that over generations, come back to cemeteries, start to work at them again, start to preserve them again. So, I mean, I think they're also testaments, right? These people lived here, their lives ended here, but their lives existed here before that. So in terms of their importance, I guess I have too much going. I mean, on the one hand, there's like the preservationist in me who wants to protect graves because archaeologists have unfortunately a bad history of encountering graves and not treating the graves of other people's with a lot of respect. So on the one hand, I just want to offer like a corrective to that as an archaeologist practicing in the 21st century. I want to take those obligations seriously, but also the stories that can become attached to these. So when I was working in Rosewood and Sumner the last 2 years at these cemeteries, particularly the public cemetery, or it's an active cemetery that people go by, people stop, and this is, I think, probably the most powerful thing. People stop and they talk about their families who are buried there, and in these places, particularly rural places, these family connections can go back a century or more in Florida, and understanding, that's something that I grew up in a small town in Northwest Arkansas. Attachment to place is sort of something I understand, but as the course of the 20th century wore on, and many, particularly African American communities, were not, I mean, there's no other way to really put this, we're not allowed to maintain those connections, right? There's a push that removes African American communities out of rural places and puts them into urban places. And there's a whole history to that, and that's sort of beyond right now, but that means that these places that are anchors for African American memory, we sort of, particularly those of us who are kind of privileged enough to do this work, we have, I think, even an extra obligation to do as much as we can to preserve them, to document them, and to help protect them for the future. Private landowners, like I said, within Rosewood, for instance, have done an amazing job doing this. But of course, this is really a community obligation. The state of Florida and so forth, I think, has an obligation to do this. And obviously the state of Florida is taking this. I think you're in Tampa, Tallahassee. Here in Orlando, I'm working with folks at Eatonville to do more of this work. And in some places, the cemeteries are preserved and well maintained. They just want to know where are the unmarked graves. In other places, we're discovering African burial grounds or African American burial grounds, and it's alerting us to this aspect that the African American experience is really tied into all of Florida, not just certain urban areas, and finding a way to retrieve that and in some way make amends for that, that erasure of the Black past in these rural environments. I think that is kind of, for me and for a lot of people in kind of the generation of archaeology, that's becoming our goal for the next generation. That's becoming a preservation goal.
And when you talk about preservation and you talk about incorporating a lot of different elements into preserving these types of stories, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how the the heirs, or I guess the relatives of survivors, or victims of an incident like Rosewood. How do you work with those individuals? How do you identify their stories and incorporate them into your research? And what do you see as sort of their role in doing a lot of this work?
Well, so I mean, that's there are a lot of answers to that question. So I see my role really, and maybe I don't know, maybe this is my vision of what an academic or a scholar should be. I see my role as using, I have certain skills that I've been able to, not everybody can run a GPR unit or process that data. So that's a skill I have. Not everybody knows how to work in archives or work with those complex data sets, particularly thousands or hundreds of property deeds. Not everybody even knows where to go find this information. So I sort of see my role increasingly as just offering a service, really, and not charging for it. I mean, I'm freely doing that, of course, but as descendants, either discover that they are a descendant of Rosewood, or become, maybe they knew it and now they're just interested in it. And these individuals probably every year at least a couple reach out, and some I've known 4 years, and sometimes we work together and then we part ways. And I think that happens when my desire here is sort of to act as, well, I have this information. If you having it would be helpful, I'm happy to do that. I mean, obviously, one thing that I can do very well with this research, something I don't make public, right? I'm not going to put a map out there of where all of these house sites were, because looting is an issue. And I don't want these residences, I don't want these sites looted, obviously, as an archaeologist. But something that I'm happy to do, and I've done with descendants, and I'll continue to do with the descendants, is I can go out there and say, hey, look, park on the side of the road, point to this piece of property and say, this was your grandparents or great grandparents' homestead or house site or whatever. And there's nothing there to indicate that was the case now. So really, I see my role in sort of a service position in that regard. And then, of course, in regards to how their perspectives, their oral histories and stuff inform my research, I mean, it's really varied. In some ways, it's basic stuff, right? Like, what did a house look like as I'm trying to virtually reconstruct a property? Some of these oral histories talk about, right? And that's something else that's fascinating, right? Rosewood had a mix of properties like any community. You probably had less well-off people, and you had probably very well-off people, and you had probably a very big middle class. So the oral histories tell us about those aspects. But then also, and something that I'm increasingly interested in working with descendants on, is how did your family, if intergenerational wealth was destroyed, intergenerational trauma is a real thing. How did your families survive? And in fact, increasingly, as I'm talking to descendants, how do they thrive, right? And that's just because you don't have access to structural power doesn't mean you're powerless, right? Doesn't mean you can't become successful and do good things. And I'm not trying to turn this into like some pro-American spiel, but I mean, this is really important, I think, to talk about. I'm not trying to turn it into an anti-American thing either, but right, this is important to acknowledge that even with these hardships, sense of community, family, these sorts of things became really important. I think for those survivors and their descendants, and obviously in their oral histories, that comes through very clearly. So I'm not sure if that fully answered that question, but yeah, I mean, I have a set of skills, and I think archaeologists and academics in general, we should do a lot better in putting those skills we have at the service of various communities.
No, and I think that's a very excellent point. And I think there's a lot that you've discussed tonight that has been very fascinating, and I think there really needs to be more conversation about this research and your work. So we really do appreciate it. for you taking the time to talk with us this evening. And we also appreciate everyone who tuned in to our conversation. Before we sign off, just want to do a couple of quick reminders. As you see here on the screen, don't forget that Dr. González-Tennant's book, Unearthing Rosewood, an Archaeology of Violence and Hope, is on sale now at the University Press of Florida. You do have a special code to get it at a discount price. So certainly consider that. We're going to make this recording available as soon as possible. So if there's something that you missed, if you want to watch it again, if you want to send it over to a friend or a colleague, you're certainly able to do so. And we'll send an email to everyone reminding you of that, along with our survey. We ask you to, again, take that, let us know how the program went and ways that we can improve it in the future. And finally, again, if you found this program to be informative, inspiring, and engaging, we certainly ask for you to consider supporting Florida Humanities. You can visit us at floridahumanities.org/support to learn how you can do that. So again, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you again on the 30th when we talk about the forts of Florida. Thank you and have a great evening.